Chapter on the Middle East, where we break down the major and interesting stories of the day. My name is Amber Zaman, and today I'll be discussing America's role in the Middle East, which is being debated more hotly than ever since the eruption of the Gaza conflict. My guest is Stephen Cook, the Eni Enrico Mattei Senior Fellow for Middle East and Africa Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. Stephen's timely new book, The End of Ambition, America's Past, Present and Future in the Middle East, provides a comprehensive and refreshing analysis of US policy in the region, together with sensible advice for its future conduct. Welcome to our program, Stephen. It's great to have you with us here today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
So I've read this great book of yours, The End of Ambition, America's Past, Present and Future in the Middle East, in which you advocate quite strongly for more and smarter US engagement in the Middle East. Now,
Yeah.
you wrote this book before October 7th, right? But you do mention, obviously, October 7th. I guess you added that sort of before it was published. So let me start by asking you, do you think that what the United States is currently doing in the Middle East on this subject of Israel and Gaza, do you believe that that's smart policy? Is that kind of policy engagement that you would advocate for?
So what I think first of all, you're quite right. I finished the book well before October 7th. Actually, I finished it in July of 2023. And then after the war began, I went back and added to it. And the good news for me was at the time was that everything that by reading the book you would have expected President Biden to do, he actually did. So there wasn't that much that I actually had to rework in that regard. But what I say in the book is that there are different ways, and there's a smarter way of the United States supporting Israel that does not require the United States to sign 10-year memorandums of understanding that commits the United States to provide anywhere from $3.5 billion to $5 billion a year in military aid to the Israelis, and recognizing the changing nature of the U.S.-Israel relationship and the changing politics of the U.S.-Israel relationship. And what I say about being smarter about it is that we should replace those memorandums of understandings with security agreements and treaties over technology sharing. There is a compelling case to be made that Israel and the United States, leaders in those countries, constituents in those countries want to have strong relations. But what I call for is a normalization of relations between the United States and Israel. Just because John F. Kennedy defined the relationship as special doesn't necessarily mean that 50, 60 years later, we need to treat it in a way that obligates the United States to do certain things that it might not think is the wisest thing in the world to do. So that there's a way to have, these are two countries that have special attributes, that is a place for strong relations between the two countries, but those relations should be normalized.
So are you basically saying there should be more conditionality introduced into the relationship?
Well, I'm not necessarily saying conditionality, because I think a security pact or security guarantee of some sort, I don't go into the details, I just throw that out as an idea. Agreements with regard to technology sharing, Iron Dome and a variety of other Israeli systems are things that the U.S. military is interested in, and vice versa, so that there can be agreements along those lines. I think if there is a security agreement of some type, that would kind of hammer out what the United States is obligated to do as opposed to what it's not obligated to. Now it's just kind of, we have this special relationship and we must do X, Y, and Z, and it's wrapped up in a tremendous amount of emotion. And I don't know of another relationship that we have where there's so much emotion that goes into the relationship. And I'd like to take the temperature down and recognize Israel is a country, the United States is a country, and that we have our interests, and that we should be able to treat these two countries on a certain level.
Yeah, but if you're sitting in Israel right now, you want those emotions, because clearly, I mean, it's those emotions in part, certainly Joe Biden's emotions, that is leading to this kind of unfettered support for Israel that quite a few people criticize, by the way. and I'd be very interested to hear your opinion.
I'm less concerned with how
Okay.
the Israelis feel about it than I am in terms of what's best for US politics and US interests. I would though take some issue. I think that there is a fair number of Israelis, particularly Israelis on the right, who do not like the aid relationship at all. They feel that it creates a dependency on the United States that Israel should not have. Now, I think that there shouldn't be this dependency because does weird things to the U.S. foreign policy and American politics. What they want, what the right wants, and of course this is kind of a weird position to be in when you suggest something like this, is they don't want the aid so that they have freedom to do whatever it is that they want. And we know that they want to annex both the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. But nevertheless, I think the relationship is not as broadly supported in Israel. And in fact, Joe Biden's stock in Israel has diminished significantly since the early days in October. It's still, 50-60% of Israelis support Joe Biden, but it's certainly cooled off with his calls for revitalized Palestinian Authority and for a two-state solution. I think the Israelis are not prepared for that.
Well, one of the reasons this happened, people say, at least people on the Palestinian side say, is because of the Abraham Accords, that this fueled this belief that, the United States and Israel were encouraging Arab nations to basically forget about the Palestinians and go over their heads. Of course, the Palestinian issue, solving it, etc., served as some kind of a fig leaf, but in fact, nobody's interested in the Palestinians anymore. And we do hear people say, people who talk to people, MBS say that he, in particular, has zero interest in the Palestinian issue. Do you believe that the Abraham Accords, the way they were handled, the way they were conducted, the spirit in which they were conducted, is part of the reason that we are where we are? And how will they be affected by this conflict?
No, I don't think that the Abraham Accords it caused this conflict or is a cause of the conflict. I
No,
do
one of
believe
the causes are obviously not the cause.
I don't think that it is. I think the cause of the conflict is the determination on the part of Hamas to attack Israel. I think that is it, in the context of that, of course, has been the normalization of relations between Israel and a number of countries. And those countries have made the decision, they themselves have agency, decided that their interests wouldn't be held up by the Palestinian issue. Um, did that create an environment, particularly in Washington, D.C., where there was a sense that, the Palestinian track was something that could be ignored? Certainly, but there was also the realization that there doesn't seem to be a productive way for the United States to pursue a two-state solution. You have a thoroughly corrupt Palestinian Authority, completely compromised, illegitimate, and that, where the Israelis seem determined to continue to settle and tighten its grip on the West Bank, that the Palestinians themselves had agency here, and that Mahmoud Abbas and the people around him have undermined the credibility of the Palestinian Authority and have made life worse for many Palestinians. I think when the Abraham Accords happened, there was a concern that dropping the condition on Israel that normalization would only come after the resolution of the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians would have some sort of devastating impact on the Palestinians. It didn't. I mean, it was just basically the status quo. And so I don't see how this is even causal other than to believe that, the United States wasn't terribly interested in the issue, but the United States hadn't been terribly interested in the issue for quite some time. And the United States didn't push the Abraham Accords. I think that the Emirates and the Israelis had been searching for ways to normalize their ties for at least 5 years before the Abraham Accords. I think when the ties were normalized between Bahrain and Israel, uh, the revelation that there was an all but name an Israeli embassy in Manama would suggest that these countries had been moving towards normalization for quite some time well before the United States got involved in it.
No, absolutely. I mean, I'm not suggesting that this was all America's idea and therefore everything that's happening is partially America's fault. But
No, I'm saying the sense that I get from Palestinians and their supporters is that somehow the Abraham Accords had this kind of devastatingly negative effect on the conflict or on the situation, and I don't think that's
yeah,
the case. I think that that is, I think
certainly.
it's sort of a typical thing that, Palestinians will say is that, this has been done to us when in fact much has been done to them, but the Palestinian Authority has not distinguished itself in terms of governance and corruption
But
and
regardless
legitimacy.
of who's right, I mean, would you say that the net effect of October 7th and what has ensued is that from here on it will be totally impossible to ignore the Palestinian issue, that some form of resolution will need to happen before the regional countries, the Gulf nations in particular, Saudi especially, can proceed in
I
their
think what's striking to me,
efforts, or is this just going to be forgotten after some time and it will be back to business as usual?
what's striking to me, having been in Riyadh relatively recently, is how the Saudis remain interested in normalization of relations between
Oh,
Israel
very.
and
I'm
Saudi
hearing
Arabia.
that MBS is totally
Absolutely. The price has gone up, but the price has gone up mostly at the behest of the United States rather than the Saudis themselves. So that would give you an indication that there is a genuine desire and that perhaps in time that Saudi price for normalization may once again go down. I think that the more likely outcome of the war itself is some reversion to the status quo ante rather than a two-state solution or a one-state solution. And we'll be back to a situation. Of course, globally, the Palestinian issue is once again front and center when it comes to the way people look at the Middle East, whereas it had, as everybody knows, become really a secondary issue for many people. So just the fact that globally people are looking at this and focusing on it in intense ways that they never had before might give the Saudis and other Gulf countries who would like to normalize, give them pause. But I think in time, we're going to get back to serious discussions about normalization between Israelis and Saudis in particular. If you look at Vision 2030, if you listen to what Saudi officials say, when you understand what Mohammed bin Salman is after, regional integration is an important part of their vision for the future of Saudi Arabia, and Israel's included in that.
So if I'm a Palestinian listening to this conversation, I'm going to be horribly depressed because I'm going to come away thinking, okay, all this death, destruction will have led really to nothing. Nothing changes. Okay, for a few months or say a year or perhaps a little more, the whole world will care about us. Palestine will come up in every single conversation, but then over time, it's, as I said in my question, it's just going to go away. That's a pretty awful um, conclusion. But at the same time, you said this happened because Hamas decided to attack Israel, but even the UN Secretary General came out and said this didn't happen in a vacuum.
Well,
So,
I'm not suggesting that there was no vacuum here, that there was no occupation, that there was no, a drive towards annexation in the West Bank, that there hasn't been a determination that has been enabled by the United States to uh, enable the permanent statelessness of the Palestinian people. And I make that very, very clear in the book that there have been moral costs, tremendous moral costs to the United States as a result of its support for Israel. And of course, there's a context for every conflict. However, it strikes me that, your question was, isn't it the case that this is a cause of the conflict? And what I said is the immediate cause of the conflict was Hamas's decision to
no,
embark upon Operation Al-Aqsa
clear.
Flood that massacred, up to 1,200 people, and the Israeli response was predictable. And part of what I think is a total war that Hamas and its allies have embarked upon against Israel, a total war
Well,
to
it's I was in Israel.
delegitimize Israel. And it has worked. If I was Palestinian, I would be absolutely depressed by the fact that by a number of things. One, the death, the destruction, the bloodshed, the destruction of families, the continued dispossession. I would also, and I'd be depressed by the fact that, yes, in time, this conflict may return to some form of the status quo ante where Palestine remains secondary. I'd also be depressed by the fact that the state of leadership among the Palestinian people, whether it's the Palestinian Authority, which is inept, corrupt, and illegitimate, or the leadership of Hamas, which has demonstrated, I think, very little concern for the well-being of the Palestinian people in this conflict, would leave them at that has left them in a terrible place. Yes, of course, I would be, if I was Palestinian, deeply, deeply distressed
Yes,
about
but what
what's
I
happening.
found very disturbing, I was in Israel and I was in the West Bank and just speaking to many Palestinians, repeatedly hearing the same thing. They almost sounded proud of what Hamas had did and kept asking me very pointedly, I mean, did you expect this to happen? Did you expect Hamas to be able to breach Israel's defenses in that way and do what it, to them it was almost a feat, and when you brought up
Indeed,
the
in the
issue of
West Bank,
innocent
yeah,
people being murdered, massacred, in the most horrible way, their stock response was always that this has been happening to them for decades. So it's
right.
almost like,
I
so
think
okay, that's the
I,
price to pay when you behave in that way towards
I
us.
think in the West Bank, the polling demonstrates that 70+% of Palestinians support Hamas.
Oh yeah.
Different in the Gaza Strip. The Gaza Strip, at least from the polling that we can tell, given the conflict, is that Palestinian support for Hamas has diminished as a result of the conflict. But of course, I mean, if you're Palestinian and you see you've lived under occupation, you've lived at the essentially the kind of will of the Israelis, and you see finally Palestinians breaching Israelis' defenses and engaging in revenge essentially against Israelis. I think that the response of Palestinians, the ones that you spoke to, is not terribly surprising. At the same time, it's not terribly surprising that the Israelis would use overwhelming force in response.
But zooming out a bit, I mean, looking beyond, this conflict, do you think, first of all, that this will have a game-changing impact? My impression from what you just said related to the Abraham Accords process is that actually no. Second, Mike, where do we see Iran in all of this? How does Iran come out of this? How does Russia come out of this? And how does China come out of this? Because these are all actors that you mention in your book. Um, so yeah.
I, I I think it's hard to predict whether this is a quote unquote game-changing event. I think that, there's a lot of discourse in Washington and other capitals in the West that, from war comes opportunity, and that there's this certain expectation that once the killing stops, that, the two sides will, look over the abyss and say, this is terrible and we should live together. And I think history shows that when Israelis and Palestinians look over the abyss, rather than pulling back, they join hands and jump over. And so I think that, yes, war does open up opportunities for both good and bad. And I'm not convinced that this is going to lead to a productive negotiation towards a two-state solution. The most dynamic actors in the Palestinian arena and the most dynamic actors in the Israeli political arena are all one-staters. Hamas attacked Israel on October 7th to liberate not Gaza and the West Bank, but to liberate all of Palestine. The right wing and what they mean by that is from the north, from the Israeli town of Kiryat Shimona, to the south to the city of Eilat, and from the Jordan River to the sea. And the Israeli right, where the energy is in the Israeli political arena, is on the right wing annexationists who want to resettle the Gaza Strip and who want to tighten Israel's grip on the West Bank. So I don't see from whence this war we get a two-state solution, even if you had leaders on both sides who wanted to negotiate. The minimum requirements that the Israelis have for peace are things that the Palestinians can't satisfy, and the minimum Palestinian requirements for peace are things that the Israelis can't satisfy. And that's why I've been trying to say, not because I'm a terrible person, or anything, but that I think lost in the analysis of this since October 7th is the very real possibility that we return to some version of the status quo ante. As horrible as it is, I don't see how either the use of American power in this situation or any other power is going to take two peoples who believe that they're in an existential struggle and all of a sudden make them willing to make the compromises that they've been unwilling to make up to this point, suddenly make
And
compromises. Now,
so,
when it comes to
yeah, Iran. What does
so
Iran?
when it comes to Iran, I think Iran temporarily has really uh, proven it, demonstrated its power through the use of the axis of resistance to sow as much chaos around the region. We were, you know, 10 months ago, we were talking about Saudi-Israel normalization, the integration of the region. The U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan had written in Foreign Affairs that, the Middle East was more stable than it had been in 2 decades. And now there's a multi-front regional conflict that's underway. And that is a conflict that pits essentially Iran and its proxies against Israel and the United States and Israel's and the U.S. allies in the region, however reluctantly. So there is a multi-front regional conflict, and that's good for Iran as a revisionist power in the region that has sought to push the United States out of the region to
But this
destroy Israel.
for October 7th. So do you think October 7th bolstered Iran?
Absolutely. I think
Yeah.
temporarily it has, because the Iranians have demonstrated their capabilities, and their capability has to sow chaos in the region. And they've proven the ability to do that. Now, I'm not suggesting that October 7th was an Iranian cabal, that they directed Hamas to do it. Hamas has its own incentives to attack Israel, but they are a part of the axis of resistance.
And the
Iran
whole
has supported Hamas.
dominance thing on the part
I'm
of
sorry.
Israel's escalation dominance narrative has been shattered because
That's
ultimately, when
right.
Iran attacked, they decided to be very restrained in their response. And I
That
think
I
it's
think that
only
that's
because
right.
the US tried to rein them in.
I think that's right. Although I think the difference between the two countries was, and I think the Israelis still maintain that escalation dominance, in that when Iran attacked Israel, there was essentially a regional alliance that helped, essentially, without saying so, help defend Israel. When Israel responded, the Israelis demonstrated that they could penetrate Iran's airspace at will, and chose themselves not to escalate, and so on. So I think they do have that, but nevertheless, I think the fact that the Israelis are now confronted with threats on 4 fronts, arguably, demonstrates that Iran has the ability to do things that no one believed that it would do prior to October 7th.
So then, if you're sitting in Riyadh or Abu Dhabi, what does that tell you about how you should conduct your relationship with Iran, just as you're sort of, locked into you've done the Abraham Accords because you thought that was in your best interest going forward. But then suddenly you see Iran sort of, as we just described, coming out pretty strongly from all of this. Aren't you kind of slightly nervous
I
as you
think
ponder your future relationship with the Israelis?
very, very unnerved, very, very
Quite
nervous.
vulnerable, actually, right?
Absolutely. And that's why the Saudis will say that they want to continue their dialogue with the Iranians, although the Iranians have not upheld any of the points of agreement that they made in March 2023 to reestablish diplomatic relations. But the Saudis, I think, see this resumption of diplomatic relations with Iran as a way to buy time for themselves, because they know that they are a target regardless of what's going on. The Emiratis have decided to uh, normalize their relations with the Iranians and even invest in Iran. But even prior to October 7th, when they were under attack by the Houthis and the United States didn't respond, or when the Iranians attacked Saudi Arabia and the U.S. didn't respond, that kind of reinforced for the Emiratis in particular that the United States may not be the cavalry that they thought was coming. And then, of course, October 7th has kind of reinforced and the prowess of the axis of resistance, I think, has reinforced these things. But at the same time, the United States and Saudi Arabia are engaged in a negotiation, and the Saudis are all in on a security pact, which is something that they've wanted. They don't want to move away from the United States. But they want the United States to actually be good to its word when it comes to establishing security and stability in the region. And that is directed towards Iran as it is as much for the United States directed towards China.
Right. So let's talk a little bit about Russia and China. So, when the US was perceived to be in retrenchment of, not being any interested in the Middle East so much anymore and not rising to the defense of its allies, faced with the Houthis, the Iranians, etc. Russia became kind of a power that these countries became more interested in. But we've seen now Russia bogged down in Ukraine. So can we say that alongside Iran, the other big winner is China?
Yeah, I think, a couple of
Even
things.
though
One,
China is not, somebody they would ever expect to back them militarily, because
right,
it's not how China
how
plays.
China works, right,
Yeah,
exactly.
but yeah, so let's talk about
I
that.
think there's been and one of the things that I make clear in the book is that the hedging with Russia and China
Yeah, the head.
clearly
Yeah, your
predates
yeah.
predates the October 7th or any of the recent events in the region. And
Right.
it goes back to things like, 20 years ago in the invasion of Iraq, which in their narrative is, handed Iraq to the Iranians, and many things that the United States has done in the region that is perceived as helping Iran, whether unintended or not, including the JCPOA or President Trump's unwillingness to respond to Iranian attacks on Saudi Arabia in the summer of 2019. And they have hedged with the Russians and the Chinese. Now, I think the Russians can't really offer anybody in the Gulf or anybody else in the region much. The Russians have sold more military equipment to the Egyptians than they have since the early 1970s. But of course, as you point out, they're bogged down in Ukraine and have become dependent on Iran of all countries for
Yes.
drones and missile technology, which is odd. I mean, I didn't have that on my, my bingo card that Russia would become dependent upon Iran for military technology. In any event, what I think the Russians mostly have to offer people in the region is what my friend and colleague Brian Katulis calls troll power, to
Yeah.
kind of attack the United States because of its hypocrisy in the region, whether it's the Palestinian issue, human rights, democracy, all of those things. The Russians excel at that kind of thing. And I think because Arab countries have been, targets of American harangues about democracy and human rights and so on and so forth, people like it very much when the Russians point out our shortcomings, whether in our policy or even at home, and that people respond to that in the region. But China, I think, is a country that can offer countries in the region things. There certainly, I don't think there's an expectation that the Chinese would come to their defense,
No,
but
no.
there is trade and investment and project finance and all kinds of things that those countries derive benefit from their
Well, yeah,
relationships with.
and the pissing off America value of
Well, right. There's that added advantage to it is to get the attention of American policymakers. I don't think any of the leaders in the region roll out of bed and look towards Beijing. I think they're still basically Western oriented. I think, I think, but their hedging with China and Russia is derived, at least in part, from their disappointment in what they believe to be America's, the difference between what we say about being a provider of security and stability in the region and what they perceive to be Washington's actual behavior in that regard.
well, to be honest with you, I mean, I'm just totally confused by everything. I don't see any clear path in any direction. But I guess our audience would like to hear from you, is who makes the US policy on the Middle East? I mean, obviously Joe Biden makes the final decisions, but who's shaping his views on how things should be done in the Middle East, aside from his deep emotional attachment to Israel?
Yeah, I think I mean, look, we can have a discussion about how American foreign policy is made.
No,
And
I'm
that's
talking about the
it's
individual,
a
the
no,
people,
I know.
the
I know,
human.
but this is my way of getting into that, and that, there's all kinds of ways in which the whole thing is made, and all kinds of different interests are involved, interagency, domestic politics, and so on and so forth. But when it comes to President Biden on this question of Israel, he really is an old school centrist American politician who came of age during an era in the 1970s, and his ideas about Israel and the Middle East were really forged during that period. I mean, it's become kind of a game for me. When the president talks about Israel, will he or will he not invoke Golda Meir? And he seems to do it more often than not. And it's odd. I mean, she was the prime minister 50 years ago, and not even one that was particularly well regarded by Israelis who remember that era. But nevertheless, it gives you a sense of his thinking about it. He's also someone who has said you don't have to be Jewish to be a Zionist. He brags that he knows the Hanukkah prayers better than many American Jews and those kinds of things. So he does have an emotional attachment to it, and I think that it is
And it's
the
genuine. It's
first,
really
and
genuine.
it's absolutely genuine. It's not cynical whatsoever, like some other politicians for whom have expressed great support. And so I think that he is the one who is making the policy. I think he has advisors,
On his
and his advisors on this issue, and I think that they make recommendations, but the president ultimately has set the tone and has set the policy for the U.S. government on this conflict.
But I mean, beyond the conflict, I mean, Middle East policy writ large, who are the main players? And how
Oh, I think the
much weight do they carry? Because you often hear that it's the NSC, that Tony Blinken is a very smooth, very, good diplomat, very likable person, good guy, nice guy, but that he actually has not all that much influence as Secretary of State in formulating US foreign policy, that it's more Jake Sullivan, it's the White House, and I guess because we're talking about the Middle East here, Brett McGurk. Do they have a
well,
lot?
I think that obviously, and I don't think it's unusual, especially in the kind of the way in which the National Security Council has evolved over many years. It has really become a mini State Department. I mean, when the president emeritus of the Council on Foreign Relations, Richard Haass, was the senior director for the Middle East at the National Security Council in the late 80s and early 1990s, the National Security Council was a small, basically, office within the White House complex. I don't think even more than 50 people made up the National Security Council staff. Now it's grown into something 350 people, and it's a mini State Department. And there's always friction between White Houses and cabinet agencies and departments over who makes policy. And of
Some
course,
can be
national
healthy.
security advisors want to concentrate power and policy making in their office. So I think in this administration, given the profile of Jake Sullivan, given his reputation, given his relationship with the president, along with Brett McGurk and Amos Hochstein, these are the guys who work within the White House in close proximity to the president, and I think that they have had a lot of influence. But I think ultimately, it's the president who is making these decisions. I think at sometimes, regardless of what their sound advice might be, I think the Secretary of State, because he's a long time staffer to the president, continues to be someone who is a close interlocutor of the president as well. I wouldn't count Secretary Blinken out.
No, no. I mean, I just exaggerated the point to reinforce it, not so much.
Mhm.
I'm saying he could.
But again, I don't think it's anything entirely unusual over the course of the last 30 years for the White House and the National Security Council to basically be the main driver of U.S. policy. I think to the distress of many professional diplomats, although that's why it's a coveted rotation to be at the State Department, to be at the National Security Council, because that's where policy is being made when it's really supposed to be coordinated at the National
No,
Security
and
Council
that's
rather
find your rabbi, right?
right.
My final question, Stephen, and thank you for giving us so much of your time. So, what happens if Trump wins? Can he win? And what will that do?
Aaron, everybody asks me that question. Is
Oh,
Trump going to win? And what I'll say is this. Because I'm a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, I do policy, not politics. But I think the polls speak for themselves. I think the former president has, about an even chance of winning, just like the sitting president has an even chance to win, because that's what the polls would suggest. I think when it comes to President Trump's Middle East policy, I think he is unique in many ways, and I think he's unique in this way, in that I think his first term may not necessarily predict what happens in another term, just because he doesn't have necessarily set views on things. I think he sought, for example, on Iran, maximum pressure so that he could negotiate, quote unquote, a better deal than Obama did, even if some of his advisors, like Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and others, were actually interested in perhaps even regime change in Iran. There seemed to be, kind of 7 different policies during the Trump administration on Iran, but I think the president was focused on negotiating a deal so he could say, I'm a master deal maker. Look at how much better I did than President Obama. I think on Israel, the president was driven in large part by his evangelical constituency, which was really the constituency in the United States that advocates for a robust and muscular support for maximalist Israeli policies, because it's part of the evangelical theology.
Right.
I think that may or may not continue. Although, interestingly, I read Jared Kushner's book about his time in the White House, and there was no love lost between President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu. In fact, President Trump was rooting for Benny Gantz in the series of elections that happened Israeli elections that happened while Trump was in the White House. So it's hard to know. And President Trump he said the Israelis need to finish the job. They've clearly screwed it up. What does that mean? It's hard to know. That could be a very hard line, or it could be the president saying, you know what, Netanyahu, you've screwed this up. Now it's time for me to come in and make the deal of the century. But we don't know.
We don't know. That's pretty scary, Stephen. Well, thank you so much. And
Thank
everybody
you. This has
who's
been a great conversation. I
tuned
really
in.
enjoyed it.
Well, so did I. And everyone who's tuned in, let me repeat the name of the book. It's The End of Ambition, America's Past, Present, and Future in the Middle East by Stephen A. Cook. Thanks for tuning in today. I hope you enjoyed my chat with Stephen. And for more in-depth analysis on the Middle East, please go to Al-Monitor's website at www.al-monitor.com. Thank you and goodbye.